My name is Elise Finney, and I'm a private wealth advisor and the business growth director for Argent Bridge Advisors, as well as your host today. And if you're joining us, you know the firm specializes in the financial aspects of divorce. So we just wanted to let you know that Argent Bridge Advisors offers educational workshops for divorce, and this is open to anyone that is going through divorce. We are leaders for something called Second Saturday, which is a nonprofit where we, along with other professionals, we present financial, emotional, and legal education surrounding divorce. Argent Bridge Advisors also chartered our own unique nonprofit called Done with Divorce. And this is more focused on what happens with finances after the divorce. The program works through next actionable steps in moving forward, including financial and estate planning. In both of these workshops, we reference a financial blueprint for budget and asset division, which then spawned our third workshop, where we lay out the key aspects with a mock case that includes assets and liabilities and income and expenses. And today we want to share this special blueprint of marital asset division in a unique way for our fellow divorce professionals. And our goal is really just to bring a better understanding of what we can provide to support a client during the divorce process. So we'll be sharing, I'm sharing our firm contact and disclosures, and I want to make sure that you're aware that this is being recorded. So I'm going to switch over to the agenda. So now I have the pleasure of introducing two of my colleagues, Diane Nolan and Cecile Holt of Argent Bridge Advisors. Both Diane and Cecile are certified financial planners and certified divorce financial analysts and partners at our firm. Diane and Cecile have built an extensive practice around divorce clients and their financial planning needs, not only during the divorce, but after. And today we'll be covering the topics from the agenda, but please feel free to ask questions at any point. So with that, we will get started with DoorDash and divorce, and welcome Diane and Cecile.
Thanks, Elise.
Thanks. Noticed I was muted. Thank you, Elise. And I will be, do you want to start with the agenda, Diane, or should I start with my screen?
I think Elise shared the agenda with everyone. I think we, I guess maybe Cecile, before jumping into it, the first thing on our agenda was the difference between financial planning and what we do in divorce financial planning. So I don't know if you want to take that first, and then I'll dive into some of the statistics and info that we'll cover.
Sure. And that's a question we get a lot is, you hear financial advisor and think, well, what does that mean? So part of our practice is to do traditional financial planning, gathering everybody's assets and resources and figuring out how to put the puzzle together in order for people to achieve their goals, essentially. So that is part of what we do, but what we want to really talk about today is divorce financial planning. So our roles as CDFA, Certified Divorce Financial Analysts here, is to really get an understanding of, how all the assets that a household might have might impact the rest of our clients' financial life. So we really help our clients get an understanding of, based on the outcome of their divorce and which assets they're going to end with, how they're going to be faring financially in the future. So you're all divorce professionals, so I probably don't need to tell you, but clients really have a one-time shot at getting this right. So we really want to make sure that clients understand it today and understand that the decisions they make today are going to impact the rest of their life. So we take it very seriously. And that's essentially what we help our clients with and our clients' attorneys with. So it's very specific, and we have extensive training to go through this exercise. So what we wanted to do today is take you through kind of a specific example so that you get a good idea of how we help clients during this process. So I'm going to be sharing my screen, and today we're going to be talking about Mary and John Sample. Mary's 56. She's a consultant, has her own consulting business. John is going to be in his early 60s in this example, and he's a Fortune 500 executive, very successful. And they have one child, Taylor, who is 11 years old, so very fairly young. And so in our example, there's quite a discrepancy between their incomes. So wages and deductions. So Mary, as a consultant, makes about $100,000 a year. We know her income will fluctuate since she's self-employed. John makes $750,000 a year, and he also has a bonus on top of that. So as you can see, there's a pretty big difference between the two of them. What else? As far as their assets, we can go there just to set the stage. They both own a home. It's very important for Mary to keep that home, but again, we'll talk about this more, whether it even makes sense for her or not. They have a beach property. They have about $3.3 million in non-retirement. We have Mary's business here. They have life insurance policies, long-term care policies, and then they have about $2,750,000 in retirement accounts. John has a pension too. So the total marital assets are right under $9 million. And then they have also a small 529 account for their children. So this is a very, very quick overview of John and Mary's financial situation. But we always start with, first, when we meet with a client, is we first gather data and get an understanding of where they are. So we start with this report, gather everything that they have. Sometimes people will literally drop off a box of stuff with us. And then we sort through it and start with this report to get an understanding of what are the assets, what are we dealing with here.
I would also share, Cecile, while we're talking about this page of essentially marital assets, or the property that we're discussing, for all those CPAs on the line. This program and what you're looking at right now doesn't have, though we gather cost basis information. We're going to have a discussion, and we're going to lead a very basic discussion on the impact of taxes on some of the decisions they make, but also guide our clients to professionals. People think about with divorce forensic accounting, but really there's oftentimes the couple has an accountant, and maybe the client we're working with doesn't want to work with the family accountant, or doesn't feel like he or she, but largely she, is going to be well served by somebody who maybe always worked with the other spouse. So this is a time where we would say, we're going to talk through all of these, even with all of us here today, we're going to talk through scenarios and how we approach this, but know that it goes much deeper. Obviously, where we make it a point, we do hear a lot of personal information from clients as we're going through it, but where there are concerns, discrepancies, where there are challenges with the division, which we're going to talk about, we guide them back to their attorney, and certainly back to the CPA whenever we have some tricky tax consequence to the asset division. So what we're sharing is, I think everyone that refers to us trusts us that we're going to have a deep dive into the finances. And what we thought you'd like to see is how we go about that, how we frame the discussion, as Cecile said, how we look at our what if scenarios, if you will, like if you did this, then that, and we can do it all real time. And since oftentimes we come back to share with a CPA or with the attorney, here's what we came up with. This is going to just be a sort of the steps we take to get there. Fair to say?
Yes. And so at first, we really don't, in this case, we allocated the equity of the house to Mary's side, but we really start with not allocating anything, depending on what's important to the client. So Diana, I always love your expression of, a pound is a pound, but if there's a pound of gold and a pound of coal in the equation, what is your pound of gold? So that's why we always start with not allocating anything, and through our conversation and what's important to our clients, then we'll start allocating, trying to figure out how can we best divide all of these assets.
And can you move up just a sketch so they can see that one of those down?
Oh, yes. Mhm.
Yeah, so you could see that the total is on the far right. And then John's column is the center and Mary's column is on the left. So, and as Cecile said, by the way, the first thing that I guess I'd say about that column that has the equity of the home, as you said, going to Mary, is notice on the left, the Lakeview Lane property is worth 2 million, but we deducted the mortgage and any separate property, a down payment or something that we were told was excluded from the net equity. And then net equity is over there on the far right as part of what's the total marital estate. And then finally, as Cecile said, oftentimes we hear, but I want to stay in the house. And then we would talk through the consequences of that. Same for the beach property. As you can see, it's $1 million property with a $250,000 mortgage. And so the 750 is on the far right.
And in this case, Mary wanted to stay in the house because they have a young child and they wanted to stay in the same school district. So we allocated the equity to Mary if she really wanted to stay there, and that's always where we start. Does it even make sense if you get to keep the house and the equity in the house, what other asset are you willing to give up in order to stay in that house? And in this case, if there's a $420,000 mortgage, can you afford that mortgage? Can you afford to even refinance it? So this is,
and even the extra 100 maybe that isn't hers. I don't remember who we said the separate property belonged to, but if it's not, so it might be 520, it might be, or other assets that have to be used to pay down to a mortgage that Mary can afford with her $100,000 of income and so on. I would say also the last piece on that in terms of the equity in the house, because you could tell we spend a lot of time on that with clients. That's a big one, is that this is a family where maybe it's pretty obvious with several $1 million that a 1.4 of net equity would not necessarily be a problem for Mary to keep the marital residence. But that's not, and maybe you all know this, that's not the normal situation. A lot of times, much of the marital resources are in the equity in the home. Largely, equity in the home and retirement accounts is what we see more frequently. But where I think we add a lot of value is the more complicated it gets, and that's what you're seeing down below with restricted stock, an illiquid limited partnership, and an investment account. That would be, and in this case, it's John's company stock that is restricted. And just for the sake of the initial discussion, we've kept all that on John's side of the equation. Now, John might not be opposed to sharing the stock for which is restriction is lifted during a time in which there's separating assets. And he's not opposed to liquidating shares, or maybe he is. So we definitely keep this as a starting point because it does have some complications. And we don't give a value to Mary's business, by the way, consulting largely, unless there was something that was a client list or something that was of value. So much goodwill gets, reduces the value of a consulting business. So we're saying that we want to acknowledge that she has a business. Maybe in this case, John said she has value in her business, but we haven't given it a value. That's where we'd go back and work with someone that would be a CPA that does business valuation. Did I miss anything there?
no, I don't think so. It might be premature to talk about the limited partnership, but a complexity that we run into sometimes is Diane actually had an example recently of a client who just he kept the limited partnership, right? The husband,
Yeah,
they
in
agreed
his
to
name.
split the income going forward, and all of a sudden he stopped paying his ex-wife all of the income he was receiving from the partnership. And so this is, this is not something for today, but it's something that we also do, is we kind of keep track of what's in the property settlement agreement, and we make sure that that property settlement agreement gets enforced in the back end, because it may sound silly that people would forget about such income, but it happens. So we see it as something that we do, and where we add value is reminding people what they're entitled to.
That's right. Or even a timeline of the house was going to be kept for until daughter goes off to college. And now that's 6 years away, but in 6 years from now, or maybe it's 8 or whatever it is in this example. But when it happens, then we need to start thinking through what's the present situation when we continue to work. And sometimes we don't continue to work with the client after, but the client might come back to us at some point and want to have that discussion. So, or back to any of you. And it's, again, something we can revisit based on the financials at that time.
So we have Mary's car here. It's pretty straightforward. The next thing that we added on here are life insurance policies, and that part gets a little tricky sometimes because life insurance companies or insurance companies will have their own sets of requirements. It's not like if someone is the insured on a policy, it's not like you can necessarily transfer that asset very easily. So we always talk about this too. Like, first, is the policy even worth keeping? We always look into what is the cash value there. Is there a cash value? And if there is a need for this policy to be kept, then we always talk about how to best utilize it and maintain it. So, that could be a whole session on its own, but we just wanted you to know that if it has a cash value, we definitely don't want to lose sight of it, but we go further than that and make sure that that policy is worth it and best utilized. So in this specific example, they have a life insurance policy on John. And since Mary's likely going to receive support, we're going to encourage her to likely keep that policy in place and make sure that John has some has a death benefit on him should something happen to him. Mary wants to protect her support. So, and he's also not in great health. So in this case, it makes sense to keep what they already have versus getting a brand new policy. They also have 2 life insurance policies with long-term care rider. Since they're already getting into Mary's late 50s, John is early 60s and not that healthy, we're probably going to encourage him to keep it too. But again, that has a cash value, so we want to put it on here. So he has one, she has one, so that's pretty easy. They can each keep theirs. Then we go into retirement accounts. So John has, he works for IBM. He has a 401k with IBM. Mary has a SEP IRA that she set up on her own for her business. And then John has an old rollover with 1.5 million. So, here we try, depending on what happens with, Mary wanting to keep the house and how we can divide the assets, we usually tend to assign the account to who owns the account. But, if we need to make an adjustment, we will use retirement accounts to make that adjustment. So we'll separate all of that in a minute. Oh, go ahead, Di.
I'm sorry, I just want to mention, because of something I saw in the chat, because everyone is muted, there is a Q&A box. I don't know if Elise mentioned it, but feel free to ask any questions in the Q&A box, which is the double bubble box at the bottom. I know Elise is manning the chat box, but we will take any questions in the Q&A box as well.
Definitely.
To interrupt.
Oh, no worries. Then we have a pension, and that's usually something that we see be maybe not overlooked a lot, but people don't usually assign the right value to pension. So it is an exercise that we go through a lot, is actually put assign a dollar value to a pension, a present value to a pension, so that because we hear it all the time, well, it's mine, I work for it, and I don't want to share it with you. Well, maybe that's fine. You can keep the stream of payments in retirement, but it doesn't mean that we're just going to ignore it altogether. So if someone really insists on wanting to keep their pension, we're not necessarily against it, but we do want to account for it on this report, so that the other spouse gets compensated with maybe another asset. So, you know, as you already know, there's definitely several ways of handling this, but if someone really wants to keep their pension, then we'll make sure to assign a present value to it so that we know how valuable it is. And here our software calculated it, but it's not meaningless, so we want to put it on here. So once we're done with all of the assets, we add any family debt. In this case, they have no meaningful debt other than Mary's car loan. And
And the
then
mortgages we accounted for above.
we already did. And then the children's account, because it's not technically marital property, we put below the line, but we also don't want to lose sight of it because they'll be using this money for Taylor's college.
Cecile, I just had to pop in just to make sure you saw the question in the Q&A.
I didn't see a question. The question is, how do you go about valuing the pension? Virginia courts don't make us do that anymore, but it can be really helpful to know how much people are really fighting over. Yes.
Great
So
question.
let me go through that. Pension plan, I believe it's here. So in this case, our software will do it, but we can provide you with the methodology going behind it. But it basically goes with the date of birth and the estimated retirement age, the monthly benefit. And so based on that expected stream of payment and the client's life expectancy, then the software will calculate that pension. So you know, we're happy offline to give you more detail about the methodology, but basically we have to put all of these variables in, date of birth. Go ahead, Di.
No, I was just going to say, and in this, we're using this as an example of a case where we might do that. We know that often it's just the marital share, if as and when it's paid, but there are scenarios, especially when we have a client who maybe a big part of the net worth is in the equity in the home and they're pretty adamant about keeping it. We start looking for other ways for which they can equalize the assets. And this would be an example of that. Not necessarily recommended that they forego a pension, but if necessary, we're going to explore all options.
Right. Yeah. And in this example, everything is marital because they were married throughout John's employment. But you're right, Di, we'll also calculate what the marital share of that pension is if needed.
It goes through all of that. The program will say like how many years were they married by how many years he worked and all of that. So, but again, in the interest of time, I don't think we can work through all of the math on that, but just know that it's all there. And we end up with a net present value for the sake of asset division only. So back to property division for just a minute, and we'll take you through an example of like so the marital estate was 8 million plus, and we know that Mary wanted to keep the house, and John, his restricted stock and his pension. We made that scenario up because that's what we hear a lot. So at this point, we would go in and say, look at an equal division of other assets, because Mary and John's the value of the net equity of the home and the value of what was allocated to John isn't too dissimilar. So this is exactly how we go about it. We're now having the discussion with the client in the room, and we're going to say, is the beach house, do you want John to have the beach house? Do you care what happens to the beach house? Is the beach house going to be sold and the proceeds divided? Let's assume John takes it, Cecile, for the sake of our discussion. Investment assets, again, encouraging liquidity, encouraging for Mary's sake in this example, who might need more liquidity than John, given that John has the greater income ongoing, encouraging at least taking half of the investment assets. So we'll say 50-50 on that. The challenge in what Cecile mentioned on the limited partnership is, and the reason we wanted to include it is tricky in that oftentimes these partnerships are not transferable. They aren't liquid. In the case of the client that Cecile mentioned that I have, it was actually a private partnership. The husband was with a law firm, and the law firm created this sort of private equity deal. And so there wasn't an option for any liquidity, but there was an agreement that if it's eventually liquidated, that they would share in those proceeds equally. And in the meantime, share in any distribution from the partnership. And then, as Cecile said, that we're like 10 years down the road now, and that was forgotten about. So yeah, definitely need to keep track of these things. And again, some might argue, well, I don't want to give, John already has restricted stock and John is limited, and it's a future pension benefit. Maybe he doesn't want to have the illiquid asset, but this is where it gets tricky. I guess we could say, Cecile, let's put it in John's column for the moment, just for the sake of discussion. But I would say that may or may not be the case. That we would definitely understand the argument that he's getting less of the liquid assets, but it's, in our example, it's titled in John's name. It's almost impossible to get these things divided, but we could work on that. Mary gets the business, though it has no value. And again, I think we would give Mary the survivorship life policy, if possible, making sure that, because it was written on John's life, making sure that Mary remains owner and beneficiary. We'd encourage her to keep that in force, maybe to protect her support. We'll get to the budget portion of this in just a moment. And then again, let's assume Mary keeps her SEP and John keeps his current 401k just to avoid a quadro. And then maybe we'd equalize using the IRA, but can you go and see where we are on that division?
So Mary has 3 million and John has 4.3.
Okay, so 50, I won't quite do it. Let's say 75% to Mary and 25 to John of a IRA. Maybe it's a rollover of old retirement plans.
Or he's still ahead. Could give more of the.
Maybe, yeah, maybe. What's the number there? 65. Closer.
Right there.
Yeah. So back to the report where we would maybe what we would share with the client, and the client would share with their attorney. So here's rather than everything unallocated, here's an example of, and obviously very quick, you saw how long that took, where there'd be a lot more discussion surrounding, but a division of the real estate, a division of the investments, a division of the equity, the cash value in the life insurance, and then the retirement accounts, getting them to about an equal division between the two of them. And we could get it down to the dollar. The last thing about the 529 I wanted to mention is just, obviously that's a separate asset, not a marital asset, but one party is going to be the participant in that 529 for the child. And the other, we just encourage and help get an interested party a duplicate statement going to our client so they can keep track of what happens to that 529 plan between now and when it's used when the child goes off to college.
We have a couple questions.
Okay.
Someone is asking, what are the overarching assumptions going into asset division? Equal split 50-50, assuming that there is a legal answer to this. And how does the child support factor in?
Excellent questions. yeah, we're making an assumption right now 50-50 because Cecile and I are going to address this issue of what we call like below the line negotiating. Once, assuming everything gets divided equally in this example, if, let's say, we encourage, I'll give you a real world example. We have a client who had a high income earning husband. He was going to leave the country. He was moving to Australia. And there was a lot of argument over support, maybe even an attorney I know it might be on this, might be viewing this with us and know this situation. He was an attorney, he was moving to Australia, and we were concerned about the stability of both his earnings going forward. And even though he was committed to keep working and paying alimony, in that scenario, we looked at a hybrid, less alimony and more assets. So we're starting from this 50-50 division for our discussion today. And that's likely where we would start a discussion with clients as well, which is why we're sharing it this way. But scenarios like, and it's there and noted, a property settlement between the two, whether it's something down the road or it's something, something that comes as a result of a lump sum in lieu of support, or some hybrid of that situation based on the unique needs of the client. That would all be addressed here, like what we call below the line. It's helpful for the client to understand that first it's 50-50, then John is giving you, Mary, assets, not from the joint assets, or otherwise you're also contributing to your division. So first the division and then any sort of alternative allocation of the assets.
Mhm.
And then how child support fits in, it doesn't in terms of this portion where that's, well, I take that back. If you think of it like the trickle down, the funnel, first we're looking at these assets, and then based on asset division and income that Mary will have off of the assets, and John would have off of his assets, that's going to potentially impact alimony, which will potentially impact child support. So I guess it does really have an effect. And I think we allotted for that in that we gave the assets a certain
Right.
a certain return or certain income.
Yes, we did. And the other thing too is that I didn't mention is in our example, Mary has a separate trust that has $1 million in it. So it's not even on this report, but it will factor in when we talk about support and what she has to live on.
Maybe share that separate and marital, because that's another piece that, again,
right.
we
Bear
don't
with us. It's pretty complex.
Yeah, it's a complex report, but you could just see under Mary's total where Mary's marital assets versus Mary's separate assets. So in this case, Mary must have had the 100,000 that is hers. There's that's a good allocation. Looks like we're some restricted stock that is separate to maybe because, again, in our example, John has to wait and it's not, the restriction isn't lifted, or John has to potentially continue working beyond when this will be settled in order to qualify for those stock options. So we have a certain amount in John's separate column as well. But again, great visual for Mary to understand if this is, while we're talking about these marital assets, Mary, in this example, you don't forget you have your trust assets and you have your separate down payment plus growth on the house in as equity in the house. So all of that being sort of a drinking from the fire hose, that's a division of assets. Then we move on to the budget report. So consistent with what we just said, we have Mary's, this is now John and Mary from an income and expense perspective. So Mary's consulting income, John's Fortune 500 company earnings, and then John also has a bonus, and Mary has income coming off of her family trust. And finally, because this impacts how assets may grow going forward, we acknowledge that each are participating in a retirement account. Mary and her self-employed retirement account, the SEP. John and his 401k, and we know that John's receiving a match on his 401k. So while we call that tax-free income to John, it's a tax-free, it's not necessarily income, but it's a way for us to capture a benefit that John will continue to receive that Mary won't participate in. So we've had that dispute about whether this should be here or not, but we want to include it for the sake of discussion. And feel free to weigh in your views, opinions on that, but it is a resource that Mary isn't getting a match that John's going to get as we move forward.
Mhm.
And again, based on that allocation that Cecile gave the investment account, now Mary has 1,300 of income where John has 700 of income. John's also got the partnership, so he's getting the partnership income every month. And this is how we arrive at the total income. One thing that I think is, and Cecile, I think we've talked about this and you agree, what's really an eye-opener for clients, and this might sound so simple, but when we show a client that they're receiving spousal support, in this example, we used $4,000 to Mary and her child support, that it's an expense to John, which is over in John's column.
Mhm.
Can you go down, just scroll down and show it, and we'll go through the, yeah. So John has this almost 6,000 of expense that is income, tax-free income to Mary. That's often an eye opener for Mary. In other words, she's thinking, well, he makes all this money, and that's true, and I make less, that's true, but your income from John becomes an expense of John's.
Mhm.
Sound really basic, but that is always an eye opener.
We always go through it, and taxes
Yeah.
is the other eye opener that we run into too. You're right, Di. People always say, well, she makes so much, but after you add the support paid and the taxes, it can make a big difference. In our example, Mary making 100,000 only pays 2,300 in taxes
Monthly.
monthly, right? And John pays over $28,000 monthly in taxes. So it does make a difference. And we actually have a good report to show this kind of the impact of support and taxes on someone's income. So here, these are things that we already looked into, Mary's income, including everything, her salary or her consulting
Earnings.
income plus her investment income. She ends up receiving about 12,000 a month in income. John has 76,200 of income a month, but then John pays Mary support, child support, spousal support, and then his after-tax income is 70,269. Her
After support income. Yeah.
after support income is 18,064. But then if you start adding taxes to it, John is 28,741, Mary's 22,311. His after tax income is only 41,528, hers 15,753. So
We haven't added all of John's living expenses,
right,
but
we don't have
visual.
any of his living expenses.
Yeah.
But still, this is a great visual that we share with clients all the time. This is the income discrepancy when we start, but this is basically the discrepancy post support and taxes. And sometimes there's a huge discrepancy at first, and then in the end, they end up making almost the same amount. In our example, John makes a lot more, so there's still a significant difference, but we really like to show people that report so that they understand that money has to come from somewhere.
And a great comment about child support and spousal support not being taxable. We've accounted for that. The program updated immediately when the tax law changed. And so what tax Mary pays is on her own earnings and on her investment income, possibly the trust income, depending on who's paying the taxes, the trust or Mary. In this example, we're probably allocating it to Mary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. When we talk about taxes paid, it's only on their earnings, not support.
And then if you want to jump back to the report. Now, in this case, Mary's our client, and we have, from the direction of our attorney who referred, they've tasked Mary with figuring out her budget. And so because Mary is living in the home and is paying the mortgage on the house, we have the principal and interest payments separated from the insurance and the taxes. The reason being, that's going to be a number that shifts if Mary refinances and maybe has to spend more, or uses some of her resources to pay it down. But for the moment, principal and interest for each of them is allocated separate from their living expenses. We know that John has to pay into the pension. That's a mandatory payment he's making, so we've allocated for that. But we don't otherwise know, like, what are John's monthly living expenses, but we do know Mary's because she's done the work and we're working for her. So in this case, we've allocated all of the expenses that Mary has shared with us. We haven't judged them. We haven't told her she spends too much. We haven't commented on her travel budget, none of that. We simply applied it first to see what does Mary need, and is that something that's not unreasonable from the perspective of John paying, and also, if we get that far and that's all agreeable, is that something we should talk about getting up front versus getting in as a regular or traditional support payment. And then, because in some cases, this issue of who's paying for what when it comes to the kids, we have a whole separate report on the children's expenses. And of course, anybody raising kids here in Northern Virginia know how expensive private schools are, and the children's hobbies and interests and sports that they play. So we do have an expense report for the children separate. And what we noticed is that, sometimes John may be more inclined to pay for these expenses that are in excess of what child support looks like. He may be willing to do that because he enjoys that Taylor, or whatever we name the child, is her sport, or goes to camps in the summer and that sort of thing. So we've allocated private school tuition and how they save for college on a pro rata basis. And so in this example, we're encouraging a discussion about that private tuition and college savings rather than 50-50, which might be one party's preference. We've explored and have applied, based on Mary's income relative to John's income, pro rata sharing of the expenses. Okay, so we've got and we'll come back to that. Jen had a question about how we work with the clients. And so all of Mary's expenses are included, including contributions she makes to her SEP IRA account. We've also accounted for healthcare costs, which will be separate. We've accounted for the family healthcare costs on John's side of the equation. Again, because we know that we may have his pay stub. We've included his retirement contributions that were voluntary, as well as that requirement to pay into the pension. So at the end of the day, and it's Mary's car, it's Mary's loan, and Mary gets the loan payment on the car. So before we know any of John's other living expenses, we do know Mary's. We've got an understanding of Mary's total expenses, and the expenses we're aware of for John are included. And then again, as Cecile highlighted, taxes, and then we get down to total income less expenses and taxes, and the net of the budget. That might be helpful in some circumstances. I think it's reassuring to someone like John to see what his after paying support income might look like. For Mary, sometimes we just try to get that right to the dollar, and then any discussion beyond that. In other words, we used 4,000 in support. We probably could use 3,000 or near 3,000 in support for Mary, or maybe if the the allocation of the assets in the property division went a different way, maybe she would have had more income, and we would reduce the support that way as well. This gives us some wiggle room to say Mary could pay a little bit more of the child's expenses, or Mary could save more for retirement. Mary's, budget again hasn't been vetted. The other thing is, maybe we get to the end and there's no more money for John after his expenses and no money left for Mary. Then we start digging into how do we manage and adjust the expenses accordingly. Any other thoughts on that?
No, I think what's relevant about support is we always present the client with what kind of present value calculation that would be too, so that, some people are really against writing that monthly check. So we always give people the option to say, hey, maybe you don't want to be getting $3,000 or $4,000 a month for X amount of time. Maybe you just want to get a lump sum or more of an asset and be done with it. So that's when we go through that property settlement option that Diane was mentioning earlier. So in this case,
I'm sorry.
Am I going too fast there?
No, that's good.
So in this case, if Mary was going to receive 4,000, I mean, again, it could be 3 might be enough, but let's just go with 4 for the sake of this example. If she were to receive 4,000 a month until John reaches retirement age, then the present value of that stream of payments would be a little under $300,000, $276,000. We always use the 10-year T-bill as a discount rate here, just the safest thing you could invest the money in. So that's how we get to this present value calculation. So let's just say John is completely averse to paying Mary any kind of support, and he just wants to be done. Then we could enter this below the line. As Diane said, we don't want a client to basically be compensated for something that was already 50% hers. So let me show you on that report where it would show. So we would put it here below the line after they already divide assets is where we would put that settlement. So
while you're shifting, I'll just share, there's a great question from Jennifer, thank you. How our fees are paid, and is there a requirement that clients work with us or invest with us? Absolutely not. The work we do with clients relating to divorce financial planning is just on an hourly basis. So we have a letter of engagement, they engage and know that we're charging them $3.50 an hour, and that they're going to get an invoice. And but we often get questions, even when we're working with them on the asset division. I don't know what I'm doing. Can you help me with this later? We really keep that separate and apart. We're going to focus solely on this asset division, cooperating with and coordinating with attorneys and accountants and whatever resource needs to be brought to bear for the client's benefit. We're going to start there. We're going to work through that. And then oftentimes, and we, as Elise mentioned early on, we do a whole separate webinar and education series on what that looks like when you're done. When the property settlement's done, there are a series of things that we encourage people to do. Aside from just, now you have to get these assets titled in your own single name, you also have to make sure that you have an irrevocable beneficiary on a life insurance policy. You've got to retitle the house. You've got to maybe refinance. And that refinance could be, you've got to show a certain amount of income for a certain amount of time before a lender will look at you. And those are all things that we do some post-divorce planning with clients around when they choose to engage us. And in some cases, they're perfectly content, and we want that. We welcome that. If they're really happy with and have long time worked with their financial planner, we encourage them to go back and get that work done. But that planner may not have the wisdom or experience to work through what we just showed you here today. I think, unless we have questions, that's the gist of our blueprint and what we wanted to share with everyone. I would say so many of you have been supportive and confident in what we do, and we really appreciate it and welcome any questions offline or now.
I'll just add that we're always available to have any of your clients come and attend any of our webinars. As I said before, we have Second Saturday, Done with Divorce, and then we do the Blueprint of Asset Division. So right now we're running them all online, so they're webinars, and we're not charging. We eventually will go back into person, hopefully soon. But we really just put that out there for our community, and we've had people, I mean, we do make it state specific, but people do even attend out of the state, and it's just a great resource for people to come, and everything's located on our website. So we have a divorce tab, keep track of all of our dates. We put them out there for the year with all the links, and we really thank everyone for coming. We hope that there was a great takeaway today, and we will see you soon.